National Subcommittee on National Security, Illicit Finance, and International Financial Institution will come to order. Without objection, chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Mission Critical, Restoring National Security as the Focus of Defense Production Act Reauthorization, Part 2. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. And I think it's important to note that this is an area that we in the Financial Institutions Subcommittee don't normally get into, but I think it's very important because we do have it's within our purview, and because we don't get into it a lot, we need to have a lot of, I think, hearings on it to be able to understand the issue, be able to get all the information that we can to make a good judgment and understand what we need to do, what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, what we need to be taken care of. So we appreciate the witnesses being here today and able to do that. With that, I recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. On March 12th of this year, this subcommittee held the first part of this hearing to learn more about the history, the current landscape, and what the future might hold for the Defense Production Act of 1950, or the DPA. During that hearing, we heard testimony from the Congressional Research Service and other expert witnesses about the important role of DPA plays in maintaining our national defense posture as the envy of the world, as well as the dangerous state of our current defense industrial base. Today, we will continue that conversation as we welcome witnesses who represent the key agencies who execute the DPA: Commerce Department, Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Defense. We don't often see these agencies here at the Committee on Financial Services, but we hold the great responsibility of having a sole jurisdiction over the DPA. DPA is set to expire in September 2025. In light of the increased use of DPA by both the current and previous administration and the need to restore our defense industry for our great power competition with China, we have started to examine and consider this legislation in its entirety. DPA, which Congress passed in response to the Korean War, affords the President a broad set of authorities to ensure that American industry has the capability and capacity to meet our nation's national security needs. Our hearing in March highlighted some key areas where Congress may wish to consider improvements to meet the current moment. Since DPA was reauthorized in 2018, the federal government has utilized the financial tools of the DPA at a pace far exceeding previous years and in more creative ways. In March, we heard the director of the Ronald Reagan Institute, Dr. Roger Zakheim, discuss some of the urgent needs to address military shortfalls in munitions and weapons, naval shipbuilding and maintenance, and the supply chain and strategic materials shortfalls. In the meantime, Congress acted to address the ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and Israel, which further exercise and stretch our defense production industries, and all while the People's Republic of China's military continues to build up its capabilities to threaten its neighbors and challenge our own military. These are all stark reminders of how critical a strong national industrial base is to the national security of the United States. I was encouraged to see in December of 2023, the Department of Defense, through the leadership of our witness today, Assistant Secretary Taylor-Kale, reduced the first ever National Defense Industrial Strategy. Their strategy does a great job of outlining the priority areas that are critical to a modern defense-focused industrial ecosystem. Today, I hope Dr. Taylor-Kale will tell us more about the report and how Congress can act moving forward. It will also benefit our members to hear how the DPA has been helpful in its past and current implementations, as well as the areas where DPA might be underutilized. One other area of concern that I share with Dr. Zakheim and another witness, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Dr. Jeb Nadiner, is that many of these expanded authorities for which the DPA is being used seem to have little to do with what the legislation was originally intended to accomplish. One of his earliest executive orders, President Biden invoked DPA authorities to strengthen U.S. supply chain resilience. He followed it up by using DPA Title I authorities to require suppliers to provide key inputs to infant formula manufacturers ahead of other customers. In June of 2022, the President began using DPA to accelerate domestic production of energy technologies like solar panels, insulation, heat pumps, biofuels, and power grid infrastructure. Heat pump case remains particularly controversial, not least because the dependence is primarily on allied manufacturers and seems to have little to do with national security. Some of these actions, unfortunately, have reinforced the narrative that presidents could exercise powerful DPA authorities for reasons unrelated to national security. This undermines support for a critical tool that, when used properly, is essential to building and maintaining our nation's ability to defend itself and our allies. To be clear, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The DPA is an essential mechanism that deserves reauthorization before the end of the next fiscal year. but it also needs a thorough review and a careful adjustment, not just rubber stamp approval from Congress. Today's hearing should give us critical insight into the factual applications of the DPA. I think it's critical that our members be informed and up to speed on all of the applications of DPA. I want to thank our witnesses today for being here and for their own ongoing engagement with members and staff. I look forward to the testimony. With that, I yield the balance of my time and recognize the ranking member, Ms. Beatty from Ohio, for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing here today for part 2 of our discussion on the Defense Production Act, DPA, which is set, as you've heard, to expire September of next year. The DPA gives the President the authority to take various actions to ensure the supply of materials and services necessary for national defense. For example, the President has the power to prioritize government contracts, waive international trade requirements, and offer incentives within the domestic market to enhance the production of critical materials and technologies, if deemed necessary for national defense. As was discussed at our previous hearing on this topic, Congress has amended the definition of national defense over the years to include emergency preparedness, critical infrastructure protection and restoration, homeland security, and more. Let us be clear, the DPA does not give the President a blank check to spend taxpayers' money. It is subject to the annual appropriation process with limits on how many funds can be rolled over to future years. In addition, the authority must be renewed periodically, and we are here today to continue our discussion on reauthorization. There is no doubt that the DPA grants broad powers that must be applied in a careful and prudent manner. Nevertheless, it is imperative that we assess national defense through a wider lens and leverage tools like the DPA wisely to bolster domestic supply chains, support our allies, enhance U.S. competition, and preserve the United States' energy independence. In recent years, we have faced novel challenges that have threatened our national security in some shape or form, from the COVID-19 pandemic to the increasingly disastrous effects of climate change. To tackle these issues, the executive branch has appropriately invoked the DPA to produce ventilators and vaccinations, as well as to accelerate domestic manufacturing of clean energy technologies. While some of my colleagues may claim that these threats are beyond the scope of DPA, I would argue that the preparation, prevention, and deterrence of key components of national defense. In fact, the Department of Defense itself has listed some climate change threats to national security since 2008, stating that it must be a part of every strategic decision the department makes. The DPA is a critical tool to ensure that we are prepared for anything, and it is imperative that we continue to use it in an intelligent way to bolster United States strength and stability. Strength and stability. I look forward to working with my Republican colleagues in a bipartisan manner to reauthorize this essential legislation in the coming year, because I believe today, hearing from our witnesses, and if we work together on the same page for the same goal, we will get there. Thank you once again to our witnesses, and I look forward, and I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back. With that, we welcome the testimony of our witnesses today. Dr. Laura Taylor-Kale is Assistant Secretary of Defense for Industrial Base Policy at the U.S. Department of Defense. Ms. Thea Rozman Kendler is Assistant Secretary for Export Administration at the Bureau of Industry and Security at the U.S. Department of Commerce. And Ms. Cynthia Spishak is Associate Administrator at the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Thank each of you for taking time to be with us here today. Each of you recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral testimony, presentation of your testimony. Without objection, each of your written statements will be made part of the record. And with the 5 minutes, I have the gavel, and so don't be long, but be concise, and we look forward to your remarks. With that, Dr. Taylor-Kale, you are recognized for 5 minutes to begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Madam Ranking Member and distinguished members of the committee. I am absolutely delighted to have this opportunity to testify before you today alongside my colleagues from FEMA and Commerce. In addition to timely, consistent appropriations and multi-year procurement, reauthorizing the Defense Production Act may be one of the most important actions that the Congress can do to ensure that the U.S. industrial base is ready to support defense needs and the warfighter. DoD's primary aim in the use of the Defense Production Act is to increase the readiness and resilience of defense industrial base in support of defense critical needs and the warfighter. As such, the DPA is an essential tool for national defense and the successful implementation of the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, and the recently released National Defense Industrial Strategy. Since Congress enacted the DPA in 1950, the executive branch has invoked DPA authorities to manage defense-related production capacity, defense critical supply chains, and to protect and strengthen the U.S. industrial base in war, peace, and during national emergencies. At this time, I'd like to thank Congress for adding the United Kingdom and Australia to the definition of domestic sources in the FY24 National Defense Authorization Act, allowing DoD to enter agreements with companies from the US, Canada, UK, and Australia, reinforces important alliances like AUKUS and supports the short and long-term development of secure defense critical supply chains. Going forward, the DPA will remain an essential national defense tool for mitigating supply chain vulnerabilities in our key weapons and defense systems. Defense production is a deterrent, especially when undergirded by a strong and innovative industrial ecosystem. Fully executing DPA authorities in support of domestic industrial production remains a priority for this administration's defense industrial policy. Our adversaries attempt to use supply chain vulnerabilities to weaken the U.S. military and economy. Through our role on CFIUS, we see how adversarial capital investments in the U.S. industrial base further attempt to weaken the United States by robbing our industrial base of technological innovation. And the DoD remains vigilant against adversaries using adversarial capital to weaken the U.S. defense industrial base. As you noted, Mr. Chairman, in January of this year, the department published the first ever National Defense Industrial Strategy, where we highlight 4 key strategic priorities for building a modernized, resilient industrial ecosystem: resilient supply chains, workforce readiness, flexible acquisition strategies, and economic deterrence. As such, the reauthorization of the DPA and the full use of the authorities are absolutely essential for implementation. We use the Defense Production Act to, of course, prioritize defense needs within industrial supply chains, along with the Department of Commerce, and to allocate scarce components. We also use it to alleviate pain points in supply chains and expand domestic manufacturing of critical technologies and processing and production of critical minerals and strategic materials that are vital for our defense capabilities and for the warfighter. So what has DoD achieved in the numbers? Since the last DPA reauthorization in 2018, appropriations have increased dramatically for Title III, from an average of about $70 million a year to about $1 billion. As the first Senate-confirmed Assistant Secretary for Industrial Base Policy, my top priority is overseeing the effective management and execution of DPA authorities and appropriations in support of our military and the warfighter. In FY23, we executed a total of $733 million in DPA Title III awards. This helps strengthen defense critical supply chains and microelectronics, strategic materials, and kinetic capabilities and energy storage and batteries. Demand for DPA assistance is at an all-time high, and I predict that it will remain so going forward as we continue to work at alleviating these pain points in the supply chain. In my written testimony, I noted a couple of key areas where Congress can consider adjustments to the DPA law. I look forward to continuing to work with this Congress in a bipartisan manner, and honored to represent the Department of Defense today. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Gentlelady yields back. With that, Ms. Rozman Kendler, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Luetkemeyer, Ranking Member Beatty, members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the opportunity to testify alongside my colleagues before the subcommittee on the critical role the Defense Production Act, the DPA, plays in supporting our national defense. The Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS, has several responsibilities in implementing DPA authorities under our national security mission, and I'll use this opportunity to highlight 2 of them. The rest is reflected in my written statement for the record. First, DPA Title I authorities authorize the President to require acceptance and priority performance of contracts and orders to promote the national defense. The Commerce Department has held this authority under Title I since 1950, when the DPA was first enacted. Today, we implement these authorities through the Defense Priorities and Allocations System regulation, which is used regularly to support the purchase of industrial resources needed for U.S. national defense requirements. We work closely with interagency partners to ensure the timely delivery of industrial resources needed to ensure our national security goals. The Defense Department is the largest user of the DPAS. Under a delegation from Commerce, DoD places an estimated 300,000 DPAS priority-rated contracts and orders each year. The DPAS is a vital part of the Defense Department's procurement system, and we at Commerce are proud of the role we play to support our service members. Commerce also may authorize priority ratings on a case-by-case basis. For example, in coordination with our colleagues at the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, we granted the General Services Administration and the Architect of the Capitol DPAS priority rating authority for items needed to support the safety of U.S. government buildings, including congressional facilities. Commerce has also provided DPAS rating authority in support of the Wildland Fire Protection Program, National Airspace Operations, and Land Port of Entry construction. These activities demonstrate the role of the DPAS as a force multiplier for our national defense. In recent years, we have witnessed unprecedented supply chain challenges for the U.S. industrial base. Commerce, in coordination with interagency partners, has responded to a significant increase in DPAS requests for assistance. Last calendar year, we took 59 actions, the highest by the department in the last 34 years. If the DPA's Title I authority were to lapse, Commerce would no longer have statutory authority to support procurement on behalf of any entity other than the U.S. Armed Forces. Without Title I, we would have available only the limited authority provided by the Selective Service Act. This occurred during Operation Desert Storm. We would not be able to place ratings for wildland fire equipment, aviation network equipment, weather satellites, all of which we have undertaken with our interagency partners in the last 12 months. Shifting gears, Commerce also acts under Title VII of the DPA. Title VII authorizes the President to obtain information to assess the capabilities of the U.S. industrial base to support the national defense. Under this authority, for national security purposes, we use industry-specific surveys to obtain essential information from U.S. industry. This is information unavailable from any other source. Production, research and development, export control, employment, those are some examples. Commerce develops custom surveys that focus on that key information, and our assessments provide findings and recommendations for government policymakers and industry leaders to ensure our national defense. Over the last 38 years, the Commerce Department has conducted industrial-based assessments and surveys on a wide range of topics, from healthcare products to rocket propulsion. Survey information that we collect supports data-driven policies and actions in areas critical to our long-term economic and national security. We're currently in the middle of 6 surveys and assessments related to various long-standing and emerging industries. When completed, information from these surveys and assessments will provide the U.S. government with insights needed to understand the health and viability of the assessed industry sectors. In particular, in January of this year, we issued a survey to determine how U.S. artificial intelligence AI developers are developing frontier AI models and what they're doing to keep those models safe and secure. Data collected from this survey will inform the development of safety and security standards for frontier AI models and help spur AI innovation. If our DPA Title VII authority expires, we will lose a critical tool that helps to ensure our national defense. We will be unable to collect the unique data that enables assessment of the health of our industrial base, depriving policymakers of important data to support decisions. The Department of Commerce is eager to work with Congress to reauthorize the non-permanent provisions of the DPA. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back. Ms. Spishak, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Luetkemeyer, Ranking Member Beatty, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to discuss reauthorization of the non-permanent provisions of the Defense Production Act and the importance of reauthorization to the promotion of the nation's homeland security and emergency preparedness needs. The Defense Production Act is the primary source of presidential authorities to expedite and expand the supply of materials and services needed to accomplish national defense priorities, including certain civil emergency preparedness and response authorities. As was said and enacted back in 1950, the DPA was Congress's response to the production shortages the nation faced during the Korean War. Specifically, the DPA was intended to ensure that the federal government could efficiently channel industrial resources during times of crises. Since its enactment, Congress has consistently acknowledged the evolving importance of the DPA by reauthorizing it over 50 times. Today, in addition to supporting the Department of Defense programs, the DPA also affords critical authorities that FEMA, the Department of Homeland Security, and our federal interagency partners leverage in executing the civil defense efforts that underpin disaster preparedness, response, critical infrastructure protection and restoration, and counterterrorism enterprises. Since its establishment in 1979, FEMA has been at the forefront of administering the DPA by ensuring that the Act's broad and evolving mandates are effectively managed, from military preparedness to comprehensive civil emergency response. This responsibility was envisioned by Congress in 1950 and has been reaffirmed through successive executive orders and legislative amendments that have expanded the scope of national defense beyond strictly military activities. FEMA's continued stewardship of the DPA underscores the necessity of maintaining a central coordinating body that is adept at navigating the complexities of national crises and mobilizing the nation's industrial base. As threats to national security become increasingly diverse and complex, FEMA's role is more vital than ever, ensuring that the DPA's capabilities are aligned with contemporary security needs and that the Act remains a cornerstone of national resilience and preparedness. In addition to our work in administering the DPA, FEMA leverages DPA authorities in executing its responsibility for coordinating the implementation of policies and programs that ensure efficiency and the national mobilization of resources in response to national security emergencies. The authorities provided in the DPA are critical to FEMA's ability to execute this important responsibility. Reauthorizing the expiring provisions of the DPA will enable FEMA, Department of Homeland Security, and other federal agencies to continue efforts vital to the nation's homeland security and emergency preparedness. This includes prioritizing contracts that provide necessary resources to enhance national resilience, emergency preparedness, critical infrastructure and protection, and efforts that reduce the risks associated with acts of terrorism. Reauthorization is also vital to maintaining key abilities to invest in expanding the productive capacity of the domestic industrial base to ensure national defense needs are met. As Congress considers the strategic direction for the reauthorization of the DPA, it is crucial that its authorities address the evolving landscape of national threats that transcend traditional military functions. Congress must ensure the maximum flexibility in the DPA authorities to ensure the United States can swiftly mobilize and respond to a diverse array of threats with efficiency and precision within the necessary controls of program administration. FEMA stands ready to work with the committee and our interagency partners to ensure that the reauthorization of the DPA can meet this changing risk environment and advance the nation's homeland security. Thank you for this opportunity to appear before you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back. Before I get started with my questions, I just have a quick comment here for Ms. Rozman, Kendler. We're very disappointed in your agency, Ms. Kendler. We tried to get a hold of through your staff many times wouldn't answer phone calls, wouldn't answer emails. You guys did not want to appear today, and that cannot be tolerated. Our committee has jurisdiction over DPA. You handle the execution of it for your agency. We have to work together. For your people to drag their feet and not respond to our committee folks is unacceptable. Will not be tolerated again. With that, the questioning begins. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Oh, the gentlelady from California, the ranking member of the full committee is here, and we'll recognize Ms. Waters for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have a prepared 1 minute statement, but I'm really bothered by some other problems that I see growing in this country. And as I understand it, the Defense Production Act, or DPA, is an important tool that ensures our country is prepared for and can respond to any security threat that may arise. Mr. Chairman and members, there are security threats coming from the former President of the United States almost every day. He talks about violence if he's not elected. He talks about a civil war. He talks about, basically, if he's not elected, there will be bloodshed. And so I consider that this is a serious domestic threat coming from the former president. Is that included in the Defense Production Act? It's not fair, absolutely, to bring the question up today, but I'd like to put it on everybody's mind. I yield back.
General time has expired. With that, we go to questions for from the committee. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. First question is to Dr. Taylor-Kale. I sit on the China Select Committee, and we've heard testimony from our generals and done tabletop exercises that demonstrate that the United States lacks the stockpiles of critical munitions for a military engagement with the PRC over Taiwan. Doctor, looking at the current defense stockpiles and considering the capacity and production rates of our defense industrial base, from your perspective, do you believe we are adequately positioned to meet and defeat the global threats facing the United States and our allies, including the current wars in the Middle East and Ukraine, as well as a potential conflict involving China?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. First, I want to state off the bat again that the Department of Defense uses the DPA to increase the readiness and resilience of our industrial base, specifically to address the threats that you mentioned in support of national defense. I think it's important to note that we learned a lot over the last few years after COVID and Ukraine and what we've had to do to mobilize the industrial base. But our industrial base has managed to keep us safe and provided warfighters tools and capabilities to fight our adversaries in times of need. I think that we view the importance of having surge capacity and more resilience in the industrial base is very important, and we intend to continue to use the Defense Production Act.
Do you think we're ready? That's the question. And here's a good example. In the paper that yesterday, one of the national papers, is talking about China's satellite fleet poses threats to U.S. troops in potential Pacific conflict, and this comes from the Space Force Intelligence Chief. They've got 200 more satellites in space today than it did just a few years ago, and their capacity has increased 550%. That's a real threat. Are we ready to address that? That's the question.
Sir, the PRC remains our pacing threat, and certainly Taiwan being the pacing scenario. The way that we use the Defense Production Act is really to address a lot of the pain points in the supply chain for critical technologies and capabilities that we need in order to meet the threat.
Okay, follow-up question then. Because we sometimes misuse the DPA, does that pose a danger for these industries, these different companies, whenever they have to then turn their company around and actually respond to a national security threat? Do you understand my question?
Absolutely,
do they
sir.
have the capacity to do two things at one time? I guess that's the question. And do they have the ability to prioritize away from the one that is not necessarily a national security issue to the one where our lives are hanging in the balance?
And sir, I would offer that part of the way that we use the Title I authorities is to exactly address this issue. So the prioritization of defense critical needs is one that we work with within the department and with the Department of Commerce to do so, so that the industrial resources that we need, the critical components that we need for our key systems, for our weapons, are available at the time that we need them.
Okay, Ms. Spishak, you talked a while ago about different ways that you interact with all these different agencies and deliver services. So from that standpoint, can you help me see how we can be more targeted with the DPA? Because to make sure we do it the right way, that we don't have extraneous things that we're doing with it that are necessarily national security oriented, but we can target where we need to go. Is there a way to do that?
Chairman, thank you for your question. I think the most important thing to keep in mind, and several of us have alluded to the evolving threat landscape, is trying to balance the authorities within the Defense Production Act with the checks and balances associated with the program administration. And so by continuing to offer that flexibility up front, it allows us to meet those growing needs, but also make sure that we are paying attention to those checks and balances and evaluating the work.
Dr. Calais again. There's one of our industries back home. I guess you kind of have to. I guess we go back to help me understand the process here of how an industry or an individual company can access the system. Because apparently, what goes on is you'll send out a request for proposal. They'll send you their information, but they never heard from again. Defense Department doesn't respond in a timely fashion and say, "Hey, we didn't ask you for something for this particular piece of military equipment or hardware where we were looking for something else." Instead, they get something back and say, "Well, there's no funds available," or they don't answer at all. Can you talk to that issue?
Absolutely, sir. So first and foremost, there are a couple of different ways to submit white papers into the Department of Defense. We have the newly stood up Defense Industrial Base Consortium, OTA. But I will note that it has been my priority as Assistant Secretary to speed up our execution times, including our response to industry.
Okay, what we may do is send you a question and ask for a written response on that, because we've got some specific examples of people who are not being responded to. Thank you very much, and I'll yield back. With that, we could recognize the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Beatty, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start or continue with you, Madam Assistant Secretary. The diversity and the value of the DPA Title III projects administered by the Department of Defense have expanded in response to the emergencies that our nation and the world have faced over, let's say, the past 4 years. For example, the Biden administration chose appropriately to employ Title III authorities to assist munitions and critical minerals producers in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the Biden administration has also invested in clean energy. So the question is, in what ways do these DPA uses address national defense and improve national security, followed up by what is the department doing to ensure adequate oversight of this DPA-related work?
Thank you, Madam Ranking Member. I will note that using the Defense Production Act, I think you're referring a lot to the Title III projects that we manage. Indeed, has increased pretty substantially over the last several years. 5 years ago, we had $70 million and a handful of projects, and now we have a much more robust portfolio. In prioritizing how we use Title III funds, the Department of Defense, my office, really works very closely with our military services to understand their needs, and pairing that with the industry proposals and white papers that we receive, and also ones that we solicit as well. Getting at and making sure that defense supply chains have the critical components, have the critical minerals, as you mentioned. Russia holds a lot of those, and as well as the PRC, making sure that we can bring some of that processing onshore and have them available at will for our defense supply chains has been absolutely critical and important for the department, and frankly, a really key use of the DPA for national defense. As far as oversight, my office oversees particularly the Title III awards. As I mentioned earlier, part of my work here has been to really expand and make sure that we are moving and executing in a timely fashion. We've increased the capacity to be able to execute awards over the past year and less than that even. We've reduced the amount of time that it takes for industry to get a response for our proposals. All of this is really in service of making sure that our military services and the warfighters have what they need at the time that they need them, and that there are no delays in our weapon systems as a result. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Now I'm going to address this to all of the witnesses, but we'll start with you, Ms. Rozman Kendler. The president can author a presidential determination for Title III projects without congressional notification, with potentially significant implications for national security, supply chains, and the United States economy. Understanding that this would differ by specifics, what might be the positives or negative effects of imposing additional congressional notification or authorization requirements for Title III activities?
Congresswoman, I appreciate the question, and certainly, and also to the chairman's point earlier, we are eager to collaborate with Congress, of course, and especially with this subcommittee. The Commerce Department does not maintain authorities under Title III, so I think I need to defer that to my colleagues. Thank you.
We'll go next to you.
Thank you, Ranking Member. While DHS does have the authorization to have a Title III program, we currently don't have it appropriated and aren't utilizing it, so I don't have any further comments.
Okay, then, Ms. Spishak, let me ask you this. As we have seen, especially over the past 4 years, the DPA can shape how businesses in the United States operate and how the economy functions. Does the DPA fit in with other tools the executive branch has to shape United States industrial base, including supplies or services or labor?
Yes, I think it plays a critical role. It's one of many instruments, as you highlighted, and I think it's one that's important to always recognize is always available. It's not a requirement to have something like a public health emergency or a national emergency to be able to be utilized.
Okay. Unfortunately, my time has expired.
Gentlelady's time's up. With that, we go to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr. He's chairman of the Subcommittee on Financial Institutions. He's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I'm just kind of curious because I am a member of the bipartisan House Military Depot and Industrial Facilities Caucus. I represent the Bluegrass Army Depot in central Kentucky, Madison County, Kentucky, and we just completed actually demilitarization of the last remaining legacy chemical weapons there as part of our chemical weapons treaty obligations. But in terms of our arsenal depots, are we utilizing those facilities to enhance the industrial base sufficiently? And is there any interface between the authorities of the DPA with those depots and arsenals to surge our supply chain resiliency and defense industrial base?
Thank you, Mr. Representative. That's a great question. First, I'll note that the DPA does allow us to do Title III investments in the organic industrial base, and we continue to look forward and working closely with the services in order to do so. The organic industrial bases and the depots are very important components for our overall industrial ecosystem and making sure that we have the components and capabilities that our warfighter needs at speed and at scale. I will note that in the FY25 budget that was recently released, modernizing the organic industrial base is a key aspect of it. The Army is preparing to invest over $4.5 billion over the next 15 years just in that area. So I completely agree with you, sir, and understand the importance of them.
We have a great relationship with the Army Materiel Command, and I just think that some of these depots, the one I represent included, is underutilized and can really be an asset in this mission. Dr. Taylor-Kale, another question for you. The U.S. currently has 250 billion tons of coal waste, and coal ash in reserve, which are rich in rare earth elements and other critical minerals. How is DOD utilizing the DPA and the United States' rich domestic resources to ensure our critical minerals and rare earth stockpile can compete with foreign adversaries such as China?
Sir, the critical minerals and strategic materials are an absolute key component to many of our weapon systems, including ones that we've used for support for Ukraine. And certainly, we've used the Defense Production Act to really get at some of the pain points and alleviate those pain points in the supply chain. So, for instance, since 2020, the Department of Defense, through DPA, has invested over $1 billion in critical minerals and strategic materials, using actually DPA as well as the Industrial Base Fund. We continue to prioritize the use of DPA for critical minerals and strategic materials, as well as processing, as well as in production as well. So I completely agree with you on the importance of it, and certainly the importance for our key weapon systems.
Let me follow up also, because the Biden administration's environmental laws have made U.S. mining one of the most comprehensively regulated industries in the world, leading to a permitting process that can take years or even decades for each project. And the administration's posture on mining, I think, will only lead to more roadblocks. So despite America being blessed with some of the largest mineral reserves in the world, instead of producing for ourselves, we depend on other countries, often adversaries like China and Russia, for all or most supplies of many of these critical minerals. Could you discuss the role our long and arduous domestic permitting process plays in our inability to mine the minerals that we need for our defense and energy requirements? And as you answer that question, this could be a win-win-win. There's a lot of, coal is not being combusted as much anymore because of environmental laws, but there's a lot of unreclaimed coal mines in this country. There's a lot of coal refuse out there. They're hazardous sites. We could harvest critical minerals, not for combustion, out of coal, but critical minerals, and remediate a lot of environmental problems in our country all at the same time. Win-win-win, but we need permitting, and we don't need roadblocks. So can you speak to that?
Sure. I know we're running out of time, but I want to underline that domestic production and increasing capacity is an absolute priority for the Department of Defense. A key objective of the administration has been to make sure that we can meet current and future demand. We use the Defense Production Act Title III authorities to work on the domestic aspect of processing, but also working with key partners and allies like UK, Australia, and Canada. And I think that we can continue to discuss how we can better make sure that the Department of Defense has the supply of critical minerals that it needs for its weapon systems. And I'm happy to further follow up with you.
Gentleman's time's expired. With that, we go to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Waters, who's the ranking member of the full committee, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. While I understand thoroughly what DPA means and what it can do for us in many ways to basically, protect, to deal with the supply chain, on and on and on. And I understand what we were able to do during COVID. I'm not focused on that today, but I appreciate our witnesses who are here today to talk about climate change and other things that certainly need to be addressed as we look at DPA. So with that, I yield back the balance of my time. I'm focused on other domestic terrorism.
Appreciate the comments from the ranking member. With that, we will, and she yields back her time. With that, we go to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, who is the chair of the Committee on Small Business.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, witnesses, for being here today. Current conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine have decreased our domestic defense industrial stockpiles, and with the strongest military in the world, it's imperative that we prioritize rebuilding our defense industry and stockpiles to ensure our readiness in the face of any emerging threats. Now, we cannot afford to let our guard down, especially as adversaries like China seek to expand their influence and undermine global stability. It's essential for our national security that we maintain a robust defense capability to safeguard our interests and deter any potential threats to our sovereignty. So, Doctor, With the number of conflicts happening around the world and the ever-growing threat of the Chinese Communist Party, do you believe that our defense industrial base is sufficiently equipped? And additionally, how can we enhance our base and production to optimize our national security capacity?
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the question. I want to reiterate that as much as that we've had to rely on the defense industrial base, particularly over the last 5 years, to bring the capabilities that our warfighters need and that our allies and partners need, and frankly, the American people during COVID, it's really stepped up, and it continues to do so. We use the Defense Production Act every day to help prioritize and build more capabilities in our industrial base. I also want to highlight the point that you make about stockpiling and very much the importance of it. In the National Defense Industrial Strategy, we highlight the importance of stockpiling and using it to create more resilient supply chains and ensure that we have defense-critical components at the time that we need them. My office, my team, we work very closely with the National Defense Stockpile Manager to ensure that in implementing and executing on the Defense Production Act, that we're working closely with stockpile needs. So again, completely agree with you on the importance of the stockpile for our own overarching posture and for our own security in using the Defense Production Act.
Okay. Main Street has stepped up to help defend our country since World War II and continues to provide to our national defense today. As of 2021, nearly 60,000 companies and over 1.1 million employees have contributed to the U.S. defense industry. These contractors range from the smallest businesses to large corporations who help to meet supply chain needs and work to develop the latest innovative systems and capabilities. It's crucial that we can ensure that there are opportunities for small businesses. I chair the Small Business Committee. Most businesses are small, and it's imperative that we make sure they have opportunities to enter this space and give them a chance to compete. So again, Doctor, could you elaborate on the key relationships small businesses have with the defense industrial base and the necessity to increase opportunities for small businesses in the space and create more competition?
Sir, I completely agree with you. The small businesses are an absolute important part of our defense industrial base. I will also note that in terms of DPA Title III awards that the department issues, about 40% of those awards tend to be to small businesses. We use the Title III awards, again, for the needs of the services and also to alleviate pressure points in the supply chain, but we're also using them oftentimes to create more competition and make sure that we eliminate sole sources of supplies of key material. Small businesses are a very important aspect of this, so we will continue to support small businesses through our Office of Small Business programs and our various programs for small businesses, as well as through the Defense Production Act.
Since the 1990s, the defense industry has seen 90% decrease in prime contracting space from 51 contractors to 5. It's important to recognize the increase in the number of contractors leads to more reliable supply chain, scaled efficiency, less backlogs, and this increased competition, again, keyword competition, helps to ensure that our national defense is ready and strong. So we must continue to allow the free market to work to keep our nation secure. So in the small amount of time we got left, Doctor, could you elaborate on how increasing competition in the defense industry could lead to greater innovation and cost effectiveness for the development and acquisition of military equipment technology, increasing our base's capabilities? Competition drives prices down.
Sir, completely agree with you. We, again, think of the work that we do through our programs in small business as well as through Defense Production Act Title III as part and parcel to helping to create more resilience in the defense industrial base, create more competition in the system. Again, oftentimes what we're trying to do is address critical supplies and material where there are sole sourcing. And so again, using the authorities that we have through DPA and the others that Congress has given us is really part of how we're trying to build more competition in the industrial base, so that we have more cost efficiency and be able to provide more capabilities to the warfighter.
And my time is up. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we go to the gentleman from Texas. Mr. Gonzalez is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. And I'd like to thank all the panelists for showing up here today to talk to us. I'd like to begin by discussing voluntary agreements under the DPA and this will be to the panel, whoever wants to chime in on this. I believe that there's only one currently in effect tied to public-private collaboration at the height of the pandemic, which is still very near and dear to all of us. This collaboration brought together the best minds on a volunteer basis to collaborate and coordinate what was needed to get the United States and our people and our economy through COVID-19. The group wraps up its work next summer, and when the 5-year period of this agreement expires, are there ways to leverage these voluntary agreements to plan ahead for future pandemics or other crises, to build and stand by an industrial capacity for a period, for a potential surge of use during a conflict? It's been suggested that these voluntary agreements under DPA could be the ideal way to prepare for these kind of contingencies. I'd like to hear y'all's thoughts.
Thank you for your question. I'm happy to start where you started with the pandemic voluntary agreement that was established. And you're correct, it was established for 5 years, so it will come to a close towards the end of next year, provided we don't see any changes in the current conditions. Under this voluntary agreement, we did learn a lot, and I think a couple of those learnings will be really helpful for future voluntary agreements. To your point, I think it's a great opportunity for us to figure out better ways to integrate the civilian, military, and the private sector in terms of collaborating in a space that will not violate any antitrust laws. In particular, it took longer than we would have anticipated to get the voluntary agreement stood up for a variety of reasons, including this is really the first one that has gone through implementation to that level. And so I think that those, now that we know what those mechanisms are, we're looking at ways that we can think about that in the future so they're in place in advance of something that we would want to be ready for that engagement around.
Thank you. Any recommendations you would make to the committee today as we look forward?
I'm happy to take that back for the record and reflect on some of the learnings that we had through COVID as we bring this current voluntary agreement to a close.
Very well, thank you. Also, as we've seen, especially over the past 4 years, the DPA can show how business in the United States operates and how the economy functions. How does DPA fit in with other tools the executive branch has to shape the U.S. industrial base, including supplies and services and labor? And do you see any gaps in coverage that should be a concern to folks in Congress?
I'll start off there. Again, for Department of Defense, our main goal is to use the Defense Production Act, all the titles, to build resiliency in the industrial base for defense critical needs. So I'll defer to other agencies on the broader economic concerns. But again, we use the DPA alongside, basically sometimes we use Title I, Title III, and the information that we get out of Title VII in order to create a more robust response in certain critical sectors of need. And I'm happy to get back to you with more information for the record as well.
I'd appreciate that. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, go to the gentleman from Georgia. Mr. Loudon is recognized for 5 minutes.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all our panelists here today. A very interesting subject since I come from about 30-year career in the IT sector, and cybersecurity has and is always and will be a great concern. Ms. Kendler, one of the United States' greatest defense assets is its cybersecurity workforce. Even though the demand for cybersecurity-related talent has far outstripped supply, the U.S. still boasts one of the largest pools of cybersecurity talent in the world. Unlike our adversaries, most of these talented professionals work for private firms outside the state defense and intelligence apparatus. In their sobering 2020 report, the Cyberspace Solarium Commission highlighted the need to designate responsibilities for cybersecurity services under the Defense Production Act. More recently, CISA Director Jen Easterly suggested that the agency is exploring ways that private incident response firms could be, quote, compelled to assist the U.S. government in response to a large-scale, drastic cyber attack against the United States. So with all that, the question would be, could you briefly explain the benefits of using the Defense Production Act to respond to a cyber-related national emergency?
Excuse me, I certainly share your concern about protecting our cybersecurity workforce and ensuring that they have a significant role in our national defense. The definition of national defense under the DPA is not something that the Commerce Department administers.
Okay.
We work with DHS, particularly in the cyber context, and if they were to place, under our delegation, if they were to place a rating order here, based on their definition of national defense, that's what would enable that to move forward.
Okay, would anyone else like to tackle the question, the benefits of using DPA in a cyber-related national emergency? Dr. Kale?
Sure, sir, I'll make a quick note on this. I think, again, the benefit of the Defense Production Act in general is that it allows the president the authority to recognize when there's a national emergency and then apply the tools of prioritization, allocation, as well as direct grants or purchase commitments to sort of tackle the problem. So, and then with Title VII, being able to gather information from industry as Commerce does, you know, when you put it all together, it really allows for the ability to tackle a problem from many different angles. So DOD hasn't used the authorities for cyber-related issues, but again, if the president were so determined that we needed to, or there was such an emergency in place, we would look to potentially use the Defense Production Act.
Is there anything that we should keep in mind as we move to reinforce or reauthorize DPA next year, especially when it comes to cybersecurity? Anyone? Yes.
Well, I will note that, again, in my oversight over defense industrial policy, and again, small business, we have a defense industrial-based cybersecurity strategy that was also released this year, just a couple of months ago. Cybersecurity is one of the key issues for manufacturing and small businesses. We worry about the ways in which small businesses will be able to address some of the cybersecurity needs that the Defense Department has. I don't believe that this would necessarily fall under the purview of the Defense Production Act, but it's certainly one where the department is addressing using other authorities and the other tools.
Ms. Spishak?
Thank you. I just wanted to reiterate that based on the definition that Congress updated in 2003 around national defense, as my colleague was alluding to, it does cover the protection and restoration of critical infrastructure systems. And so there would be, I could imagine several scenarios where the preparedness or the response to a cyber incident for critical infrastructure would be something that could be covered by the Defense Production Act.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Dr. Kale, can you briefly, I just have a few seconds left, but could you briefly explain standby procurement contracts under Title III of the DPA?
Sir, I believe you're talking about purchase commitments, and these are a critical tool. We have not used them yet. We have use cases that we believe we'll be able to use in this coming year, but it allows us to be able to essentially buy material or guarantee to buy material in advance. It's helpful particularly for strategic materials, critical minerals, where we need some sort of an offtake and a way for the Defense Logistics Agency, the National Defense Stockpile, to be able to use it.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we go to the gentleman from Illinois. Mr. Foster, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to our witnesses. Yeah, I think the two most significant recent uses of this are, I think, the COVID epidemic and also AI, the recent AI executive order. And the COVID thing, I think we built into the CARES Act mandatory GAO reporting on what went on, because you're in this interesting box. It's almost by definition, it's an emergency. And so you have to bypass a lot of the paperwork for normal, sending stuff out for bids and so on. And that has a huge opportunity for potential corruption or all sorts of bad things. And so that what we came to in that instance was combining using the authorities and very strong GAO oversight. And I was wondering if you have any comments on whether that's an effective thing, just the knowledge that the GAO is going to be looking over your work as you're doing all of this, things on a very tight time scale. Is that a model that's worked well, or does it just sort of, any comments you have on whether we should continue to make that part of a large-scale use of the Defense Production Act?
I'll comment quickly, sir. First, I think anytime that you have oversight over something as powerful as Defense Production Act, it offers many opportunities to learn. And certainly during COVID, we learned a lot in the department about execution and how to execute quickly and efficiently. As a result of what we learned in COVID, and since then, we've taken steps within the department to move to work more quickly with our execution agent. You'll see the suggestions that I had for ways to improve the DPA law will particularly help the Department of Defense, where right now we have a sole and exclusive executive agent. In times of emergency like in COVID, we really need to be able to move much more flexibly. And frankly, as our DPA Title III appropriations increase, having more flexibility with our execution offices will continue to be helpful.
Yeah, as I recall, one of their main GAO conclusions was that the HHS in particular was not practiced in using the Defense Production Act because they traditionally hadn't really been an emergency response organization for national security emergencies. And so I think there's just a lot of valuable information. I was on the COVID Select Committee in the last session of Congress and worked with now Chairman Mark Green on GA oversight of Operation Warp Speed, where I think the DPA was used to very effective use. Anyway, now to AI, it's last October, President Biden invoked the DPA in his executive order on AI, and using these authorities, they called for AI developers to share safety information, including the results of relevant red team testing with federal agencies. I think this is an important approach, but I wonder what happens when these reports come back. And is there anything you can say about, have you received any of the red team reports back? Have you set up a team to interpret what they mean? And what's the game plan here?
Thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. We're very excited about the opportunity presented in the DPA and the EO to survey the very small number of frontier AI model developers about exactly what you mentioned, the safety and security as they develop frontier models. The results are still the results of our survey are still coming back. We are working very closely.
So you received at least some information back from them?
As a normal process here, we have back and forth with the companies that receive surveys to make sure they understand what we're looking for and to make sure that the results we get are useful to us. So that's a normal part of the process. We have started to receive information. That is, of course, extremely sensitive. It's unique information.
So you don't intend to make this public? If you find something really scary in the red team results, that will be communicated back and hopefully they will fix it? Or what happens next if something bad is discovered in the red team results that the companies are not dealing with?
Absolutely. We use the results of our surveys to inform policy decisions. So if there is something that we found in that data that we would need to use or other members of the government would need to use in some way, we can certainly
Well, I'd be
affect
interested
that.
in your plans on sharing them both with the public and with Congress on, if you discover something that you think we should know about, I'd like to know that there's a plan for communicating it back to us.
It's extremely sensitive data that is highly protected, but we certainly want to make sure that we can action it as appropriate.
Thank you. My time's up and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, but he makes a great point. Again, we need to be working together with you and with us to make sure we do the right thing here and protect our country. Thank you. With that, we go to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all to our witnesses. So clearly we have some very severely escalating global tensions, Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, Iran, various situations in Africa. So I guess the main question, Dr. Kale, is our industrial base prepared to surge? Should it be required? Do we have a plan for stockpiling? Is some of the production sites, are they aware that they are production sites that we're counting on to surge for perhaps, 2 or 3 significant conflicts? Are they aware that they may be tapped? I'll start with those questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. The DOD, through the military services, through my office, through the Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment, has regular ongoing dialogues with industry, and specifically along the lines of key weapon systems that are needed for surge for wherever the conflict may be, whether it's the current conflict in Ukraine, Israel, and also to address the pacing threat in the Indo-Pacific. I will note that one of the key issues that we see are certain long lead times for the fielding of certain systems to the warfighter. Part of how we use the Defense Production Act, frankly, sir, is to actually address some of these long lead times.
The Navy has expressed some concerns about steel production for our ships. I have concerns as well with our natural gas. Of course, we have a prohibition now on exports. We should be, of course, looking after the well-being of the European Union, which could use our natural gas, particularly if there were multiple severe conflicts throughout the world. And I would imagine that's what the Defense Production Act is, and you folks are engaged in. Can you address the steel production and if you do in fact have natural gas concerns, not just for us domestically, but for our allies?
Sir, certainly the need for energy is a key one for us as well as for our allies and partners. Using the Defense Production Act, we're not making investments that address natural gas or steel per se, but I understand completely your concern and how this will affect our allies and partners as we address conflicts around the globe.
Ms. Kendler, that might be within your role. You have concerns about that?
Congressman, if there were an area here that we could explore with a survey, we've done that before under Title VII of the DPA, to gather information on the industrial base, we could certainly engage in.
A survey? Come on.
Well,
EU needs natural gas. They're going to get it from somewhere, and sometimes they're getting it from Russia and other places, and that might not be a very friendly, business partner in the near future. Let me ask you this: is the SBR situation? We're at about 30% at best of capacity. Is that an example of our preparedness in other, minerals and other items that we, energy, for instance, other production capacities that are important to our domestic security? I'll ask you, Ms. Kent.
that's not something that's within my purview, sir, but I do.
Well, it's got to be within one of your purviews.
I'm sorry,
The
can I-
SBR being at 25% to 30% of its capacity, that's not a good example of our preparedness for defense production. So, and that's energy, which runs everything. Is that an example of our capacity, or is that an anomaly?
Sir, I understand your concerns around energy. What I will say is that the Department of Defense and my office, we don't have oversight over the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, so I would have to defer to the Department of Energy or Department of Interior for that.
I think it was last year, if I could ask you this, heat pumps, were $250 million spent on heat pumps out of the Production Act, Defense Production Act. And then, curiously, there was another $250 million for critical minerals, which were purchased from overseas. In fact, many from China. Can somebody explain that?
Well, the questions around, you're referring probably to Title III. The questions around heat pumps, I'll have to defer to the Department of Energy as those were their awards. We received $250 million from the Inflation Reduction Act for
That's what this
for
money was
critical
from, right?
for critical minerals. But
I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. If we could follow this up later, that'd be
sure,
great. Thank you.
happy to do so.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, go to the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Nunn, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for the committee members for being here today, particularly those speaking on the defense production. The U.S., as we all know, is a strategic leader in the free world, in large part due to our arsenal of democracy. What you're helping to provide for this is essential. And the hot conflicts that continue to rage in the Middle East and around the world, continuing throughout our area, our strategic stockpiles, as we all know, have continued to dwindle. And the ability to not only re-support, but find new ways into this continues to be challenged. The U.S. has the most capable innovation and manufacturing capabilities in the world, and so I think we all collectively want to find ways to do this effectively. So with that, I'd like to talk about leveraging the full spectrum of the Defense Production Act to allow the U.S. to fill our existing gaps and outputs and harness the full potentials of our partners, both within the industrial sector, the innovative sector, as well as our foreign allies. So let's get started. First off, I'd like to begin with you, Dr. Taylor-Kale. I appreciate you being in here today. As we look at what we are doing in the Defense Production Act, particularly in Section 3 here, we have identified that there are more and more foreign partners who potentially have a potential to be with us, the United Kingdom, Australia. Would you support DPA Title III awards being made available for foreign companies, even if they spend those funds potentially abroad?
Thank you for the question. And again, I want to underline that the department really applauds the Congress for redefining domestic sources to include Australia and the UK. As it currently stands, we give awards to companies that are planning to do projects in the United States or in Canada. As of yet, we haven't actually issued a DPA Title III award for a company working in Canada. And then now that we have the new authority for UK and Australia, we'll be able to do so there. But our priority is domestic sourcing and domestic production. And generally that means for companies that are planning to do work in the US and now also Canada, UK, and Australia.
Which is great. As we expand into that, I guess I want to know, are there certain things that would be more effectively done with our, in this case, our Five Eyes partners minus New Zealand, in a more efficient way, particularly when we're talking about submarine development for containment of potential adversaries in the South China Sea?
So the way in which we've talked about using the Defense Production Act, particularly with these expanded domestic partners, is really to address, use it for our mutual benefit to address supply chain concerns. So we have defense critical supply chains that are a concern for us, as well as our, the Canadians, the UK, and the Australians. And so the way that we plan to use these awards is really to address how can we use mutual benefit to address some defense critical supply chains.
Thank you, Doctor. Let me ask a more specific question then. Under DPA Title III, do you have the ability to award to a foreign entity that would build in a foreign country? Does the authority exist?
My understanding of the law is that we have the ability to award to companies that are based in the US, UK, Australia.
Right, so like the Joint Strike Fighters, obviously we can build components in all of those areas. That would make sense, correct? Same could be said for software?
As long as the companies are from the US, UK, Australia, Canada, and also working in those countries.
So what's the average length of time for receiving a DPA Title III request once a final government reply has been delivered? And let's just say in the last 2 years.
Sure, in the last 2 years, we've improved it where now it's from the time that we receive a white paper to when we make a determination to the company. It can be anywhere from 3 months to more. Where the time has come into place and where is decreased time is in the actual obligation of the awards. Again, it's been my priority as Assistant Secretary to decrease those times, and with the new Defense Industrial Base Consortium, as well as working more closely with our Air Force partners, we're going to be able to reduce those times to 12 to 16 weeks.
Well, that would be amazing if that's the timeline that you're able to do. I think we've all experienced and collectively the valley of death here, particularly for folks who want to come into this sector. Right now, we only have really 5 major defense contractors, so much innovation available. I would encourage us to look collectively at how we can provide better on-ramps for these folks, how we can lessen that timeline, and particularly with our allies, being able to bring on the innovation necessary at the time and place of need. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I yield the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we go to the gentlelady from Texas. Ms. De La Cruz is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, witnesses, for being here today. As we look forward to reauthorizing the Defense Production Act, we're confronting a world that is more and more in conflict than it has been in many years. With the wars raging in Europe, our ally Israel engaging in a war that keeps threatening to spread, and China becoming belligerent towards its domestic neighbors, it's a critical time that this committee actually stay focused on what the uses are for DPA, and that DPA is not used for political controversy or to compete against allies and our friends. As you know, I am from Texas, so my question has to do with critical minerals needed for a wide range of industrial purposes, including defense. And what I mean by that is 32 of 37 critical minerals are either concentrated in China or in other countries with strong diplomatic or economic ties to China. And only 5 of the 32 are concentrated in the United States, Australia, or Canada. This, in my opinion, is a strategic weakness, and we need to enhance our capacity to build out supplies of these minerals. As I mentioned, I'm from Texas, and in Texas, we recognize this, and we are happy to be on the receiving end of a number of DPA facilitated projects to refine rare earth minerals. The previous administration used its DPA purchasing authority to put a floor on the price of rare earth elements refined in the United States, including, again, in my home state of Texas. Dr. Taylor-Kale and Ms. Kendler, do you believe that China would just drop prices to drive U.S. critical mineral companies out of business if DPA provisions like this were not in place?
Ma'am, I want to underscore the concern that you're raising about the PRC's interventions in the critical mineral space. This is something that the department has been concerned on and really focusing our DPA Title III investments to address the military services needs. We use Title III. So, for instance, I'll give an example. You mentioned using Defense Production Act not just for defense needs. Well, again, we're very concerned and focused on readiness and resilience in defense critical supply chains, but there are ways in which our investments can also be helpful in the commercial market. So, for instance, lithium batteries is something that we use in defense systems, and it's key for us. We've made investments using Title III there, but obviously lithium is going to be important for batteries that are not defense needs. So we view it as certainly focusing on defense critical needs is something that can oftentimes be a win-win for even the commercial side as well.
Well, reclaiming my time here, but do you believe that China would drop prices to drive the United States out of business? That's the main concern there, is how is China going to affect the United States if they drop prices?
I'll defer to my colleague from Commerce on, the state of play with trade with China, but I'll say that from our perspective, any way that we can increase defense production, we see as a deterrent. And we believe that by making these investments in critical aspects of defense supply chains, that we're actually making a deterrent mechanism for our adversaries.
Great, thank you.
Congresswoman, I share your concerns. We're deeply concerned about the ability of China to use critical mineral resources in a way that is contrary to U.S. national security. Take, for example, their controls on gallium and germanium that they've put in place in the last year that are of deep concern. I would also note that we have used DPA authority under Title VII to look into neodymium iron boron permanent magnets, and also vanadium. These are two surveys that we've conducted, and the results of those surveys are used for policy decisions in those spheres. And I imagine that we will continue to do that work to support our colleagues making national security decisions.
Thank you. My time is up. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time's expired. That we go to the gentlelady from California. Ms. Kim is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member, for holding this hearing. Thank you to our witnesses for staying this long. I want to let you know that I'm concerned that we don't have the naval capabilities to ensure that we are successfully deterring any conflict against the CCP in the Indo-Pacific. The Office of Naval Intelligence recently said that the CCP's shipbuilding industry fills 232 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States, and it represents almost 50% of the total global shipbuilding supply. And we, the United States, have 7 shipyards that build warships for the Navy, while the CCP operates more than 20 shipyards. This is all evidence that we're falling behind in our strategic competition with China. Dr. Taylor-Kale, how is your office thinking about bridging this gap of shipbuilding capacity between the U.S. and CCP?
Ma'am, thank you for the question. First, I want to say off the bat that the Defense Production Act is one of multiple tools that the Department of Defense has to strengthen the defense industrial base and the shipbuilding industry in particular.
So, let me ask you,
Sure.
as Congress is looking to reauthorize that DPA, is there anything that you would change in the current statute to fast-track and facilitate the shipbuilding projects?
I'd certainly think our ability to be able to execute more quickly in order to address the real urgency of the threat. It will be very important. Again, as I noted, we use other tools within the department. So another industrial-based fund that I have within my office, we work closely with the Navy on shipbuilding workforce. The Navy is also prioritizing investments and using their authorities. The recently passed supplemental offers over $3 billion in submarine industrial-based investments. So we're seeing where these investments are going into play. And again, the DPA is one of multiple tools that we can use for that.
Thank you. Ms. Kendler, can you discuss the interagency offset working group, what it does? And who are the members and how often do they meet and what results have come out of those meetings?
Thank you. We do collaborate very closely with the interagency, of course, across our DPA authorities. I think I may need to get back to you on specific details, as that's not something that I'm personally engaged in. But we across the board, especially with the State Department when it comes to offsets, we are working to engage with industry here in the United States and with governments overseas. We also take very seriously our reporting requirement with respect to offsets that make sure that we are informing Congress of what we are observing in that field.
Okay, we can follow up on that then. Ms. Kendler, you talked about Title VII, and it has historically been used to inform what are commonly referred to as the industrial-based assessments and the Department of Commerce conducts those assessments. So what is an industrial-based assessment, and what is the relevance of those assessments in relation to Title VII?
Thank you, Congresswoman. The Title VII Industrial Base Assessment and Survey Authority is very important to protecting our national security. We work to survey industry in various areas important to our national defense to find information that is only available through those surveys. It's unique information. I mentioned earlier employment data, or as we talked about in the artificial intelligence context, safety and security information that those companies do not otherwise make public. And with that information, we inform policymakers on how to move forward.
Thank you. I want to ask Ms. Spishak. The Defense Production Act Committee was created during the 2009 reauthorization. So can you discuss what, if any, impact the DPAC has made? And it's my understanding that the FEMA administrator currently sits as the chair. So can you discuss some of the duties that they serve in that role?
Thank you for the question. The Defense Production Act Committee, you are correct, was established in 2009, and the FEMA administrator serves as the chair. It's really a body that's intended to have strategic policy conversation regarding the Defense Production Act at the secretary or administrator director level, depending on the department or agency. I think the most important value that it's offered us so far is that it has been kind of the underpinning and the organizational structure for us to develop a strong interagency working group at the level of the directors that are engaging across the various Defense Production Act programs, both with the determination departments and with the resource departments. And so it's created this network for us to be able to be well coordinated, as one of FEMA's major roles is making sure that there is coordination against the national mobilization.
Thank you very much. My time's up. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired, and we have run out of members to cross-examine you today. So I want to thank you for participation. You did a great job of explaining and answering our questions. If any of our members do have questions, they will submit that through our office, and we'll submit them to you. I think I mentioned to you, Ms. Taylor-Kale, that I've got one that I want you to finish up answering, so I appreciate a quick response back on that. With that, we do hope that you respond to that very, very promptly. With that, the hearing is adjourned. Thank you very much for participation.